Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for our kind of America's colleagues that are looking this event. I am Filippo Gaddo. I'm the head of economics at Arup, and I will be the host for today kind of webinar and sessions. I will outline now the agenda for the day, for we're going to have in the next hour, and I also kind of give you a little bit of housekeeping rules as well. So this is the second event of the day. We had one this morning where we covered the similar topics and was attended by our kind of colleagues and friends in UK, Europe, and East Asia and Australia. And we have this session now, which is available for people that are on the other time zone in the Americas as well. Both events are recorded, and the recording and the presentation from this morning and this afternoon event will also be kind of shared with people that attended and have accepted the invite on the Eventbrite after that. And we will also provide links on social media as well after this event. In terms of the running session this afternoon, we'll have an introduction very shortly from Jerome Frost, which is our global planning leader in Arup. We'll give a little bit of scene setting for the work we've done in the day, followed by Joseph Hargreave. Will provide an overview of the scenarios report, which we published today. We published an original version earlier in the year, but we have an update today. Then we'll have three kind of quick short bursts of presentation from some of our colleagues in Arup. They will present a little bit of some of the project example and experiences from the work we've been doing during the current pandemic. We'll hear from Terry Williams, Hannah Griffiths, and Lachlan Miles. Before we then, after 20-25 minutes, we'll get into our panel debate. We'll be joined by Vicky Price, the former joint head of the UK Government Economic Service, and Christoph Fry, a partner at Emerald Technology Venture and former CEO of the World Energy Council. So we have quite a packed kind of afternoon, and we'll have a lot of interesting conversation and a panel debate to close it off. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Jerome for the scene setting and the introduction. Over to you, Jerome. Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It falls to me to just introduce the session and give you a little bit of background as to how this work came about. So I'm Jerome Frost. I'm the Global Cities Leader here at Arup, and I sit on Group Board, which is the board that sort of oversees all of Arup's work across the globe. Early in February of this year, seems like an awful long time ago, when there's this discussion emerging out of China about a possible disease that might be sort of something we should really take note in. Group Board took advice and really wants to understand what the implications of that disease growing into something that could really start to change the way in which we do things and have a major impact on our business. And that advice was quite detailed, quite useful for us, which enabled us to act very quickly. We banned travel within Arup a long time ahead, actually, of any lockdowns being imposed, etc. And we felt like we were on the front foot in our transition to digital means of communicating with each other. So when the lockdowns really came, we felt we were really in a very good place. Alongside that, we also felt we needed to understand what the potential impacts of a pandemic could be on our day-to-day. And we looked at that from a number of different perspectives. Firstly, what would it mean for the way we work as an organization, and in particular as individuals within that organization who enjoy the collaborative work of being together in offices around the world? How would that really change if we were no longer able to do that? Secondly, what would it mean for our various business focuses? What would it mean for the energy sector, for the transport sectors in which we work, the aviation sector, the cities in which we're engaging numerous clients in this kind of web of development and infrastructure implementation? I think then we also were quite concerned about government response, both to the sort of downturn, the risks associated with pandemic, but also to the way in which we might turn our minds to recovery, government policy at the national level, and importantly, and as we progress through the lockdown period, policy in response to the public sentiment that we're seeing. And I think that can be characterized as a kind of, to a degree, a loss of faith in national governments leading us out of this situation, and more faith actually, and more of a turning towards local leadership, city leadership, the mayor perhaps being someone who might more instantaneously and more responsively deal with your day-to-day challenges and address them. So this sense of a return to localism, if you like, driving the public mood. What would that mean in terms of the way our business is structured? But I think as we work through all of these themes, we very quickly started to realize that clearly we weren't alone, and that many of our clients were trying to grapple with an understanding of the same issues. So during the course of conducting this work, we've teamed up with quite a large number of clients, really sought their perspective, really tried to dig deep into the various business sectors in which they're engaged. And I think together we have developed a series of scenarios that you're going to hear about in a minute, and some responses, if you like, to the challenges of the pandemic, which are both helping us and helping our clients see a very bright and positive future. And of course, what a day to be having this event the day after, all of our hopes are raised by the announcement of a potential new vaccine that could be rolled out before December this year. So it's a very appropriate moment to be having this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks, Filippo.
Thank you, Jerome. That was very good to end on a good positive note as for the news yesterday. I'll probably pass it on to Joseph that will go through very quickly our kind of scenarios work that will be available as well for download later on today.
Thank you, Filippo, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'll be talking today about the scenario analysis and work we've been doing over the past weeks and months. I won't be able to go into much detail today, but I will outline some of the basic thinking, if you like, and the logic behind the scenarios. So my name is Joseph Fager. I'm the Global Foresight Leader at Arup, and I'll be talking to you about the scenario work on COVID-19. And this was developed in collaboration with our Business and Investor Advisory Group. So the scenarios were first developed, as Jerome said, in Q1 of this year, with the aim of really supporting both our group board and our regional boards in our response to COVID-19. We then subsequently published an open version for our clients and partners in June, and this latest version, which was published today, was completed on the 30th of October. So any data and indicators you find in there are really accurate up to that date. The new report is available now on arup.com, and it'll also be shared online with you afterwards. Overall, the paper seeks to explore the ongoing and potential epidemiological impact of the pandemic and the public policy response to that impact. So the scenarios essentially focus on the interaction between the epidemiological situation and the economic impact and response. The paper assumes a global perspective with some detail on certain geographies, regions, and sectors. And you can see here on the image now the scenario axis that we've used. On one axis, we have the economic and policy implications ranging from a recession to a depression. And on the other axis, we have the spread of the virus. On one end, virus is contained and managed, and on the other end, continued spread and resurgence. And that essentially gives us our 4 key scenarios. So here are our 4 scenarios at a high level, and these essentially cover the next 18 to 24 months. The situation has, of course, changed and evolved continuously since our first Q1 investigations, although the core principles of each scenario still hold true. Scenario 1, the bounce back scenario, was previously called short pause. It is still the best case scenario. Scenario 2 is global depression and a policy failure scenario. Scenario 3 is partial recovery, which talks about successful adaptation. And scenario 4 is, if you like, the worst case, which is an economic collapse scenario. So here's a quick overview of the 4 scenarios and some key indicators and data that sit behind them. There's wide variation really across cases and deaths across the 4 scenarios. Scenario 1, as I said, was previously the short pause scenario. The best case is now the bounce back, because this, if you like, this V-shaped recovery, which we had initially as one of the options, is of course no longer possible anymore. In general, the health and economic impacts will continue to be far-reaching across all of the scenarios, varying really depending on the specific epidemiological developments and the policy response to that. vaccine development, despite the recent good news, remains highly uncertain. Speed of delivery of that vaccine, the logistics behind that, the efficacy of other vaccine, and the uptake of vaccines as well are all examples of these critical uncertainties. And they also have, of course, high regional variation potentially attached to them. The logistics of the latest vaccine, for example, and the requirements for ultra low temperatures and storage are one of the issues that could hamper, at least to a certain degree, the global uptake and distribution of this solution. The other thing that we can say about this is that, of course, there's other indicators such as the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and also the global level of unemployment, which we've tried to map out in terms of ranges for each of the possible and plausible scenarios. Much more information on this and background and context and further implications, of course, in the main report. A quick overview of the business and sector impacts. Again, these are featured in more detail in the report. Essentially, our analysis of plausible impacts on different sectors concludes that the shape of the recovery and impacts across these different sectors will really be affected by a range of different factors, predominantly issues such as policies around further lockdowns, the full or partial reopening of economies as a result of that, the timing of one or more vaccines, and of course, again, the speed of its delivery to the public, and policies in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. So in this context, there really remains a significant uncertainty around how different geographies and sectors will emerge from a post-COVID world. And we need to keep that in mind when we both look at these scenarios and think about the implications for our specific sectors and industries. A few further conclusions that we can draw from this, again, more on this in the report. Scenario 3, the partial recovery, continues to be the most plausible and likely scenario, although the likelihood of scenario 2 has recently increased despite the good news around the vaccine. There's also less good news on unemployment figures and so forth. So scenario 2, global depression probability is increasing. If we think about, though, scenario 3 as the most likely scenario, it does really highlight the need to track and understand the economic and epidemiological situation much more at the local and regional level. And we are doing some work to develop some regional and local city trackers to really bring all that data and insight into one place and then be better able to inform both our leadership groups across Europe and our clients about how we might respond at a local level and what the projections for different local levels might be going forward. In terms of sectors, I think aviation and property will continue to have a rough time in 2021. The rate of the recovery will again depend on all of the factors that we've outlined. I think for property specifically, there's also a bit of a question of what assets each of our clients or partners actually holds and how some of these assets could be reutilized for different types of uses that respond to new urban lifestyles and new ways of utilizing the city, which we'll hear a bit more about later on. And then the final point to make perhaps is that the recovery of China, although impressive, is unlikely probably to be replicated in many other parts of the world, although that recovery might in turn at least be beneficial to key trading partners such as Germany, Australia, and others that do trade a lot with China. Finally, what next? What can you do with this? Well, one of the things you can do is a wind tunneling exercise, which is essentially described on this page, to really look at, well, how well will my project, my asset, my context, my business fare across these different scenarios, and what strategies can we as a firm or organization then take to respond to that. There is a lot more information, data points and insights in the actual report, so please do find it on our website or download it via the follow-up email, which will be sent to you after the event. Any further questions on the scenarios or on how to use scenarios or any other foresight or insights work, please simply reach out to one of us. That's me. Thank you very much. Back to you, Filippo.
Thank you, Joseph. That was a kind of quick but fascinating counter through our scenarios report and some of the key implications that we have in there. And we also signpost a little bit some of the work you've been doing around the city resilience kind of index and how we can adapt it to the current pandemic and the recovery, which will be kind of publishing very shortly. But after this kind of outline of the macro view, and we probably move on to the more micro kind of perspectives and looking at some of the projects and the work that we in Europe will be doing with some of our kind of clients and stakeholders and colleagues as well. So we'll have a 3 kind of short presentation and then we'll go into the panel debate. First one is a kind of Terry Williams and will present, and then we will have Hannah Griffiths and Lachlan Miles So kind of over to you, Terry, to give us a little bit of your perspective from some of the work you've been doing around the COVID-19 recovery.
There we go. Sorry about that. So I'm Terry Lee Williams. I'm the Transport Advisory Leader for Europe, and we have been looking across the globe, but more closely across Europe, at what has been going on as a result of COVID and the benefits in the short term. And you can see by this image that the Milanese have decided to reclaim their streets when the sun is shining. Cars are taking a much lesser part of life, and pedestrians are reclaiming spaces. And that's a good upside. What we're talking about, though, is recalibration and not revolution. I think it's important that we remain optimistic about cities, but cities will become an experience again, not something that we are enslaved to attend 5 days a week, something that we choose to visit because they give us something. Residential areas are already flourishing, and surveys that we've done all over the world show that economic activity is quite rapidly redistributing to residential areas. So both cities and residential areas are going to gain value, but at very different rates from what we may have previously expected. Why? Because everything that we experienced outside of the office in the city, in our 30-minute city, is now going to be contained in our 15-minute village. And that 15-minute village is something that we walk and cycle through mostly. We don't commute. We commute from the bedroom to the desk. That's about as far as we go on most days. Peak travel may flatten while all-day demand may rise, and we're already starting to see this occur in some of the lucky places that have had very low COVID rates for quite a long time in the Australasia region. But centres overall are still the busiest. They're just less busy than they used to be. Employment redistribution will follow activity redistribution. It always does. So the Moretti effect will no longer be a city-only benefit. The Moretti effect is essentially a multiplier, where we go for every knowledge worker, we end up with 2.5 times the economic gain where that knowledge worker is. Previously, that knowledge worker would have been generating the Moretti effect in the city core. Now, for 60% of the time, they're likely to be doing that in their urban setting. So commercial property, that big, heavy investment sitting in the city centre is not going anywhere. But it becomes primarily a place of collaboration and connection. It has to be reconfigured so that people have a reason to attend the office, because office attendance is now optional. And for those who've tried to make it less than optional, they've had quite significant pushback. And across Europe, we've experienced this as well. We've had very low office attendance, even for offices that are opening, until we start to make team days more common, collaboration events and information sharing events more common, and build the social into the workplace. Private property becomes your home, as it has been, but it's also your focused working place, and it's something that a lot of knowledge workers particularly value. So they want to hold on to that. So when we think about how we value places and how we value projects and how we appraise what we're going to do next, we focus on trip time, trip value, trip generation, value capture, fleet distribution, frequency distribution. None of these things are reliable anymore using our previous thinking. We must appraise on the basis that about 40% of people will work from home about 40% of the time. We need to adopt new tools, and Arup's been building those new tools so that you can choose the sequence of investments post-COVID that support that optional attendance in the city. But you also have to apply new tools to avoid habitual thinking. And the habitual thinking is the danger area, where if we think like we did previously and we try to spend like we did previously, we will not generate value as we did previously. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Griffiths and I'm from Arup's Digital Cities team. And I'm going to talk to you a bit today about how we're working with towns to adapt to a post-COVID world using digital. So Arup are currently supporting the UK government deliver their Towns Fund programme. And this is a £3.6 billion initiative that aims to level up the UK's region by funding a series of regeneration and rejuvenation projects across 100 towns. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really driven a step change in the use of digital technology and connectivity in our everyday lives, from how people work from home to how they use online healthcare and education services. So it's really proven essential to enabling the continuation of everyday life. And therefore, in this programme, we've seen a corresponding increase in the number of towns that are looking to incorporate digital projects into their investment plans. But even more fundamental to this, towns have really started to reframe their aspirations because of the opportunities presented by digital connectivity and technology. So towns in more remote and rural settings, which previously might have had to rely on kind of tourism-based regeneration projects, have now started to realise they actually have a really strong quality of life offer, but maybe limited local employment opportunities. But they've understood that by deploying fast and reliable digital connectivity, they can potentially attract workers that would usually sit nearer major urban centres. And conversely, they've also realised that by equipping their own local communities with digital skills, they can help them secure more remote employment opportunities or start kind of digitally driven businesses. So it's really changing the shift of power amongst some of these more regional towns. So I've now just got a couple of examples of the type of things we're helping some of these towns with. So the first is with their underlying digital connectivity infrastructure provision. And previously, a lot of these more regional towns stated that they were having trouble maybe attracting commercial providers. So we're really helping them map all their digital assets, whether that be fibre, wireless masts, street furniture, etc., and helping them really value that. So then they can have more productive and constructive conversations with these connectivity providers. And they can also utilise their own assets, and they understand the value of those assets to really improve the prospects of maybe less commercially viable areas to ensure the entire place receives underlying digital connectivity and not just maybe town centres. And then this has added benefits that they can layer on then future health services, future transportation services on top of that connectivity. And finally, at the other end of the spectrum, we're also helping towns really develop their digital skills within their communities. And so we've started to help a range of towns design digital skill and innovation hubs. So we've helped some towns develop community-focused hubs, which aim to provide access to hardware like laptops, basic digital skill training, but also progressing to more advanced digital skills like coding and digital marketing. Others, particularly due to COVID, we've aimed at businesses and supporting them to really embrace digital processes and new systems to increase efficiency, open up new customer channels, reduce costs. In one town in particular, we've created a digital business collective on High Street, which has helped a range of independent retailers launch digital channels to reach customers, which is far more cost effective than doing that separately. And lastly, similar to the one pictured here, we've helped a range of towns develop a new type of digital skill hub. Those that may not want to sit at a computer and work in an office space, we've started helping them develop more practical digital skills, providing them with access and training on equipment such as 3D printers, laser cutters, so giving people practical skills in rapidly growing sectors to allow them to access new employment opportunities and also start their own business. So that's all from me. I'll hand over to Lachlan.
Thanks, Hannah. Zooming in a little bit from what Terry was talking about in terms of the city scale, and then moving down into the town scale, zooming in one more step, looking at things at the building scale. Historically, when we think about cities and we think about the increasing urbanization of cities and some of those trends that have been discussed, we think about things becoming more dense, and we think about more people having to interact in the space and share the space and occupy various different activities within the same space. And so ways in which we can make sure that human movement and humans are put at the heart of that design process is something that the built environment industry has been doing for a long time. And so what I'd like to talk about for the next couple of minutes is one of the tools that we use to do this and how we've adapted it to start really trying to answer a very, very different design and operational question. So with that in mind, this is a brief introduction of a piece of software that we use called MassMotion. And so this is used across the built environment to look at those sorts of design questions. How do we get people moving efficiently? How do we move people in sufficient numbers to get those sorts of benefits that Terry was talking about? How do we make sure that we are designing these spaces with people in mind across the built environment? And so then we start to think that this starts to impact all of the different areas of the industries in which we work, in which we live. However, now this year, which is probably not a surprise to anyone, we start to think about what if we have to use these spaces in wholly different ways. The design challenge doesn't become how do we move as many people as possible through these spaces, but how can we respond and reshape these spaces in order to improve safety? And so rather than looking at how we can maximize capacity, we're starting to look at how we can separate people, how we can ensure there's a minimum separation between different groups of people, what is the number of people that we can accommodate in our transportation or our linear infrastructure or our office spaces in ways that we can effectively ensure the safety of people. And so as a response to that, some of the tools that we typically deploy have had to change as well. And so one way in which we've done this is one of the tools that we use. We've added some new functionality looking at both changing ways in which we can analyze these spaces. So looking at, rather than different operational scenarios or different designs, looking at what happens if I have to restrict a population? What happens if I have to start mapping the number of times people become in close proximity? And what we see here is, looking at two different cases, we see that these agents, the little virtual pedestrians, are turning red when they're within 2 meters. So starting to give people a bit of understanding of what these different operational paradigms mean, but then also making sure that the tools that we use are responsive to the world in which we live. And so being able to encode new behaviors and new research into making sure that people can actually spend time apart in given circumstances. And so when they have to, these agents will move closer together, but if there is sufficient space, their preference will be to maintain a set distance. And then it comes into testing all sorts of different scenarios, such as what happens if you have a certain proportion of the people who don't follow the rules. And so when we think about addressing that challenge in some of the use cases that we've come across in the last number of months, particularly in terms of a return to civic life. So how do we reopen some of our either sporting or cultural facilities? How to reopen our offices in a safe way? Or how do we start to get some of those movements that my previous colleagues were talking about back in a safe way? And so one way in which we've been looking at this is ways in which we've tested this in the commercial space. So people returning to work, what is an acceptable number of populations? How should we start rethinking about that workplace and testing it from a human movement perspective to make sure that we're not putting people at risk? But then also when we look at some areas around the world where people have come back to work, using this to help inform facilities management staff, things like that, in order for them to understand what the impacts of this new normal are. And we see that not just looking at things on the operational side of things, but we've been working with people in the healthcare and the transportation sector, looking at what can we do now, but then also how do we start to inform some of our future designs to do this from a resilient standpoint? So if we have additional shocks like this, how do we make sure that our spaces and the spaces that we live in can respond? So that's all from me. Thanks very much. Back to you, Filippo.
Thank you, Terry, Hannah and Lachlan. There was very good examples of some of the work we're doing around the COVID-19 and the application of our skills to an entirely new situation. It also provides us a little bit of thinking ahead of the panel discussion. First of all, we have a Q&A kind of facility, so if you want to ask any questions, do please kind of write them up, and we'll aim to respond to both kind of to our panelists and more generically, and we'll pick them up as we go along. We are joined now to our panel by Vicky Price, who is the former joint head of the UK Government Economic Service, and Christoph Fry, the former CEO and Secretary General of the World Energy Council, and currently a partner in Emerald Technology Ventures. So I'm going to kind of step up out again. I think, like I was saying, we went down from the region cities to buildings, and now we're going to step out a little bit towards kind of that kind of big picture around the scenarios and about the global kind of implication of COVID-19. And I'm going to kind of start with a couple of questions to Christoph and Vicky first, and then kind of Jerome can jump in as well as provide his view. We heard in the presentation this morning and today a lot about how we adapt to the COVID-19 and how the recovery will be different from where we were before. And we've been forced to, via actually the pandemic, to innovate and to change very rapidly and actually bring a new solution that probably would have taken quite much longer, and now they are kind of suddenly available. So looking at the recovery, what is your view in terms of the role of innovation and how actually the innovation might change, and how can we bring actually new ideas and new solutions rapidly to the market, and how it can help the recovery as well? So, Christoph, do you want to give us your views first, and then I'll pass it on to Vicky?
Yes, thank you, Philip. I hope you can hear me fine. We had some technical issues before. I hope that works fine now. First, we obviously looked at the post-COVID in a context of an innovation-centered energy perspective, and we asked a few questions. First, if we look at the COVID impact, if you compare that to what we need to solve a climate impact, what is the relationship here, orders of magnitude wise and direction wise? And I think the first thing you can say is that if the COVID response would be, and there's two parts of that. There's a lock-in, and there's a stimulus part of that. But if that response would be about 5% of a global economy, we are talking about 7 trillion, and which is order of magnitude wise what at COP in Paris has been said would be needed to solve the climate issue. And I think that's the first. Just an order of magnitude, it's a good reminder that we are dealing with the orders of magnitude that it takes to solve climate change. First point. Then the second question is obviously is the direction the one that we would need for climate change, and this is obviously not there's no clear answer here. There's a partial. There's partially aspects that go in the same direction, and others obviously absolutely not. And some of it will bounce back, and some of it will lock in. Now, I think the question then becomes: are the different parts of energy affected? How can they really react? Now, on the oil and gas side, we have seen quite dramatic impacts, and the oil and gas side, they are pressured to react, but are obviously hugely impacted by crashed demands and crashed prices. On the good news side, we have seen the announcement of BP or Equinor for zero net emission objectives, and I think that has certainly been that thinking has certainly been further accelerated by the COVID context. On the electricity side, the context is different. We have a huge variety in which the sector has been impacted. Some have lost up to 20 or even 30% of demand for for a period of time. Others have even gained demand because they were more service oriented. The more you're industry oriented, the more you're exposed to crashing demand, and the more you're service oriented, the more you have benefited from that. On the innovation focus side, I think it has been very clear that if you look at the sector has been hugely focused on digital response to ensure that even in COVID context, you can control system react in a way that exposes the workforce as little as possible. So there's a digital element in that. But there has also been a government response that, and particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, has emphasized e-mobility, hydrogen very strongly, and to some extent the decarbon more widely. So you can also see the industry following that innovation response. So if I summarize those three main points, obviously, I think first the order of magnitude of impact are similar with what we need to solve climate change. Obviously, directionally, it's not 100% or it's not aligned fully with the direction, but there is portions which go in the same direction, and the sector that can better react at this stage probably is electricity, because they have been less affected. But oil and gas, we have seen also some clear commitment coming out of this time towards a net zero carbon context. So innovation-wise, I think we have rather seen actually a positive trend over the past months.
Thank you, Christoph. Vicky, do you want to give us your perspective on the way you see from kind of macroeconomic point of view as well?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry, I was having problems linking in as well. But on the innovation side is really very interesting, because what we know is that overall investment has come down quite significantly. So we have a lot less investment going on right now in the world economy than was the case a year ago, and certainly before the pandemic, even though even then it wasn't really doing particularly well, mainly because of concerns about the US-China particularly, but also EU trade, and things had slowed down. So we were not growing very fast, and there wasn't a huge amount of investment going on either just before the crisis. So we were already in a sort of downward trend, if you like, in terms of the intensity of investment. And of course, if you don't have investment, you don't have innovation. Nevertheless, obviously, through this crisis, and it's quite interesting to think that we should not sort of waste a good crisis, if you see what I mean, the expression that's used. There are things coming out of it which are really quite interesting. We've been hearing a bit of that on the energy front just now from Christoph. But in addition, of course, both firms have innovated. They've changed the way they operate very significantly and very fast. It's not just working from home, which of course affects quite a lot, you know, what happens in cities and so on. But also they have taken advantage, quite a considerable advantage, of what was pushed on them, if you like, to do a lot of the restructuring that perhaps they would have liked to have done for some time, but they didn't. A lot more IT, AI, which is being put into businesses. Probably, of course, that has an impact on the long-term employment prospects of various people working in those areas. So there's been a huge amount of delayering that we have seen happening, closures of stores, rethinking, you know, online and so on, how to get to customers. So I think there's going to be quite an acceleration of that type of innovation. And the other type of innovation, of course, has been in the areas of health, where there has been a lot of investment, both public, of course, and also private. And we've seen what's been happening on the vaccine front and Pfizer and so on, but also new treatments. All of those will have a long-term impact on health prospects of people and also on how the economies work. But the interesting thing about innovation for me has been in the macro area, the way that governments have reacted. A lot of what was considered to be the mantra of the past, which is that you can't borrow above a certain level of GDP as a percentage of GDP, has now been abandoned. The EU is rethinking, for the moment has postponed its own growth and stability pact and the very strict restrictions that exist on countries operating in the Eurozone. In particular, we've seen negative interest rates. Of course, they had appeared for a while in the EU, in the Eurozone anyway, and possibly also in Japan, but now they're considered to be part of the normal panoply of tools that governments can use. Huge amount of quantitative easing, hoovering up a lot of those government debts, and also being prepared to experiment. The furlough schemes, which have been extended, you know, all across the world, more or less, except of course in the US, they decided to do it slightly differently, but just letting everyone lose their jobs and hoping for the best and giving loads of cash injections to people. So there seems to be much more of a willingness to take risks on government policy. Of course, some of that money would be wasted. It has been wasted. And of course, there are all sorts of impacts in terms of inequality that are created as a result of the types of policies that have been introduced. So the poorer have found it more difficult to work from home, for example. There have been particular sectors of the population that have been affected hugely, such as the young, the women, and actually the older as well, who find it more difficult to work in the future. I was very interested in what I was listening to before, which is the knowledge worker. I hope that this crisis can also create a premium for that. We had been expecting this to happen for some time. The whole forecast had been that we were going to see a bigger share of profits and of GDP going to workers because of this knowledge, and they will be priced a lot higher as a result. But actually, we saw the opposite. It was companies that were, in fact, expropriating, if you like, a lot of this profit, and it wasn't coming to workers. This could change. I think another of those impacts, I think, that which are very positive, is the renewed emphasis on corporate social responsibility, but also, of course, on the environmental governance and so on, societal issues that were just being discussed now by Christoph. So there are lots of positive things that can come out of it. What one always worries about is whether the underlying domestic demand and international demand, particularly trade, which has been badly affected by disputes, will recover fast enough post-vaccine to make up for some of the losses that we will have seen, or whether some of that investment will be, which we lost, will be lost forever.
Thank you, Vicky. That was, and Christoph, that was very, very good, insightful, kind of from both of you in terms of looking at the magnitude of actually where we are in terms of actually the level of reduction in demand, and also the drop in investment, but also the positive may come out of the current situation in terms of being forced upon innovation. And it's interesting, your point, Vic, as well. It's not just innovation. The most obvious one, which is around the digital and the Eastern Industry 4.0 that a lot of people are talking about, and the net zero, the challenge that Christoph mentioned, has been probably an acceleration of those trends, but also the one you mentioned about the innovation in the public sector, and innovation in terms of, on the macroeconomic side, in terms of how do you manage the economy, and breaking some old taboos that probably has been around for decades. The other innovation that probably discussed a little earlier today was around actually potentially changes the dynamic between the local and the national level. I think, Jerome, you mentioned this morning about how that might change in your intro. Actually, you discussed a little bit of the level of trust, and maybe you can expand a little bit on the dimension of the shift between the national and the city, and how actually the cities and the regions might help in the recovery.
Thanks, Filippo. Yeah, I think you're right. I think one of the really big pieces of innovation, which was beginning to emerge actually before the pandemic, and you know, like many things, I think the pandemic has really accelerated and will continue to accelerate long after kind of vaccine rollouts, etc., is this sense of a different approach to public-private sector partnering, and the way in which we steer investment. You heard Terry talk earlier about how we have to actually very much rethink some of the things that we've taken for granted for quite some time. You know, a good example is the investment in metro type schemes, or even in local energy schemes, you know, where, or, you know, another example might be in airports, where historically they were considered to be, you know, dead certs for investment houses, where the number of factors affecting their success was rather limited, that you could look at them in a siloed approach. You know, I'm only looking at my metro scheme, I'm looking for a return on ridership, which is more or less guaranteed. And you know, investors were taking a pretty narrow view. What they've now realized is that there's a large number of externalities that can really affect the performance of that asset. You know, the metro schemes now that have been heavily invested in are failing to deliver the ridership. And what investors are recognizing is that the return to that ridership is not in the hands of the metro operator, it's in the hands of city government, and the degree to which they can work with the real estate developers, you know, the other investors in the city, to re-energize and attract the working population, the leisure population, the residential population back into our cities. So to me, I think there is a real shift taking place at the moment in the way in which public and private have to come together and innovate in the way in which they look at investment for the future. The public sector is desperate for that private sector investment, and is willing, I think, to explore, where they have the freedom to, very different ways of pricing, very different ways of raising revenue. And in return for that, they're looking for longer term partnerships with that kind of broad perspective attached to them, where the clarity of role is much clearer. You know, the public sector in the provision of services and perhaps the management of some of those externalities, and the private sector doing what they're good at, which is delivering, you know, the hard infrastructure perhaps at the local level. And I think when you bring that kind of partnering down to the local level, perhaps city level, or even to Hannah's kind of town level, you also get, from a national government perspective, the advantage of, quicker response, probably quicker delivery in terms of the infrastructure required, and the advantage of having the public on board, where the public are seeing we're seeing much greater levels of trust deployed towards local leadership than is perhaps the case for national leadership at the moment. So to me, I think what we're starting to see is almost the emergence of cities as an asset class in their own right, or towns as an asset class. The investment in the long-term partnership across multiple former silos operating across a city.
Thank you, Jerome. That's interesting, the concept of kind of in cities and towns as asset class. Christoph, obviously Jerome brought in kind of the role of the private sector. And in your current kind of position as an investor, kind of how actually has the pandemic changed the perspective, the way you look and see things, and whether actually this concept of cities of asset class is something that could be developed further?
Well, first, I think it's reassuring for us to see that the appetite to, and Vicky has made a very clear point, we see less overall investment, therefore less innovation on that side. I have to say, at the spectrum where we are, we actually have not seen that decrease. We have seen, and there's exceptions. I think the oil and gas is a very clear exception, but again, electricity is not in that ball game. Clearly, we have seen that the appetite there is continued, if not heightened. So that's the first way. But I think the question is almost at a slightly different place. Once you have said you actually want to invest in innovation, and we are obviously looking at startups, we are looking at new ideas, etc. And ideally, you would want the perfect market there as well. But the reality at the moment is obviously different. If you're not in an established network, how are you going to make yourself known? How are you going to go through a diligence process where physical meetings have been certainly an important part in a pre-COVID context? How are you going to make sure that you get the references, etc.? And I think the established networks, existing networks, are becoming extremely important in so trust networks. And I'm not sure whether that the city is the only. It's certainly one way of looking at such networks, but there's obviously also the virtual networks or that come from before COVID established groupings that are very important for us here to draw on. I think that's one additional aspect that we are obviously keenly looking at. Which part of innovation will succeed? It's a part that is already somehow linked into trust networks. So that's one observation that I would like to share.
Thank you, Christoph. And it's interesting you talk a little bit about different sectors and also different, because the pandemic has affected us in a very different way, and in different regions that we saw from our scenarios work are reacted actually different as well. Some of them are in a slightly different, in a better trajectory, and some of them are a bit slower. I don't know, Vicky, whether you want to maybe comment a little bit on kind of the geographical spread as well, in terms of, from which are the areas, the regions, the countries that are currently in a different trajectory, where might emerge kind of faster or slower from the pandemic as well.
Well, we're talking about countries, of course. I mean, we know it's China that's roaring ahead. If you look at the latest PMI, global PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, which tracks what's been happening in October, what you see is that China has now, it's been on positive territory for a while. In fact, it's the one country that is likely to have positive growth for the year as a whole, 2020. What you're seeing is that a number of the other regions, and I think that was mentioned in your scenarios earlier, they are also doing quite well, the ones that sell to China, but also Germany, that has seen its exports increase to China as well. That's been the main reason why they're doing sort of, better in that sense. But of course, economically this year will still be horrific for most countries in the developed world, and in quite a lot of developing countries too. So, but there's no doubt that countries are getting out of COVID at different speeds and at different times. So we're going into lockdown. We have gone into lockdown. Europe is going into lockdown after a very substantial improvement in the summer for all of us. We probably grew by something like 15%, the Eurozone by 12%. We've seen the US as well over 8% and annualized considerably greater, of course. So there was that growth, and now, of course, the lockdown in Europe will bring it all down again. So we have to just watch this. The vaccine, as we've been saying earlier, is going to make perhaps a difference, and countries will feel a little bit more inclined to start spending more. By I don't mean individual governments, but I meant more companies in those countries. So some of that investment fall that I talked about may well get reversed, because there's now light at the end of the tunnel, and the forecast that people have been making for next year may in fact prove to be too pessimistic. So as we were discussing this morning, so the forecast had been recently, after the lockdowns, the new lockdowns were announced, that we weren't going to reach levels of 2019 until 2022. That may happen earlier. The real question is whether we will then improve the growth trajectory, so we make up for the loss we will have seen in the meantime. So that's one of the issues, and we were not growing very fast before, as I was saying, and that's the real concern. Will we have a spurt of growth because of that innovation we've just been discussing? How things going to be different? Is the green agenda going to change things? Is all the money that is being spent by the Europeans on, or will be spent on, the Recovery and Growth Fund, with a lot of green in it, going to make a difference? Is there really going to be a lot more productive investment in the future? I think that's when we're looking globally, will determine what happens next. Plus, of course, what does new President-elect Biden do in the future? But locally and regionally, I mean, that happens, of course, within each country. But in the UK, there is a serious problem, and that is that there will be an increase in inequality when we come out of this. And that's the real concern, that some regions will find it quite hard after all the lockdowns to recover. And what I worry about additionally, if I may use the word Brexit, is that some of the regional issues we've seen already may be exacerbated by Brexit, and we're not really ready for this at present.
Yeah, thank you. We managed to get it through without saying the word "b," but yes, I think Jerome.
Filippo, can I add a few things? I mean, I think that's really interesting, Vicky. I think linking this to some of what Christoph was saying earlier, I think one of the big risks that we have at the moment is that in government haste to kind of pump money into the economy, perhaps via new projects that they might be seeking to fund, we might miss the opportunity that Christoph set out in terms of really using the recovery as a once-in-a-lifetime switch to address climate change through the projects chosen and the routes chosen for that investment. I think you made the point at the end there. This sense of inequality is exacerbated by the levels of unemployment at the moment, and the challenge for governments is to address that fast. And very often the kinds of projects that we think will be transformative actually take longer to plan and implement, and get into delivery than some of the quicker wins that probably are less sustainable in the long term, but do deliver employment and frankly money into people's pockets, which then filters through to the economy. So I think there's a real challenge, and I think for companies like ours, we must address that challenge by constructing perhaps a different kind of narrative around the climate change, the net zero goal, and the recovery opportunity by focusing on this issue of social value and equity. The projects chosen, the routes chosen, I think need to be examined from that lens first. Almost what can they do in terms of social benefit and the levelling up, if you like, as to coin a phrase being used in the UK quite regularly, between different communities first, before we then construct them in a way that does also deliver on the net zero ambition and the net zero objective. These things are they work together, I think, but actually at the moment I think the dominance of the net zero argument is perhaps at risk of being overtaken, I think, by this this urgency and speed to create employment and to create to money in people's pockets. I'm not sure what would your take be on that? I'd be really interested in what you're seeing in terms of wider macroeconomic recovery discussions and what's been prioritised over other opportunity.
If it's me you're asking, I'm not sure whether.
Yeah,
sorry.
Vicky.
Okay, perhaps Christoph can say something. I mean, this is very interesting, and indeed there is a serious concern that when we come out of this, that the private sector will be trying to get back to some profits and distributing dividends and so on, and some of the net zero push may become sort of secondary in terms of what is pursued by government, although I think there's going to be a lot of international pressure to move in that direction, so we need to bear that in mind. What I worry about, particularly regions, communities, towns, is that when we come out of this, we're going to see probably quite a lot of consolidation in various sectors. So a number of firms are going out of business, and whoever is hoovering them up, if you like, or taking their space, probably going to be a company with a reasonable balance sheet that can actually survive and has survived through all this. So you'll see loads of firms disappearing, and that may affect regions and cities quite considerably, and that will be a problem. Then you're seeing in terms of financing, although there's been a lot of help given by the government, that a lot of the decisions are taken much more centrally. One of the worrying aspects of what's been happening through COVID is that bank branches are closing. Quite a lot of the understanding of what regions need and cities need and towns need is going to become even more remote, and that's the concern. So what you were saying earlier about the cooperation that's required and the networks within localities is absolutely essential, and that may well be lost. And the third thing on innovation and productivity and growth is that what you're seeing, because of the government, I think you're so spot on, but the government support to self-employed has been so bitty. The latest statistics we see is that a number of people who would have done interesting things, increase productivity, start their own businesses, stay self-employed, employ people, do exciting stuff, are now thinking, no way am I going to do this. And there is a shift from self-employment to employment that's been taking place. And that cannot be good, because obviously if that's what they want and those employment situations are not around them, what you'll find is that people just withdraw from the labour market altogether, and that's going to be an issue, and that could affect centre of towns, what they need. And then, of course, we could supply them with all sorts of extra opportunities through transport links that might actually be quite useful. But if they've already gone and the skills have disappeared, that's going to be quite a problem in terms of rejuvenating some of those areas.
Thank you.
I think if I can just briefly add, I think the reactions have been one different, obviously, of the stimulus packages that we have seen. Obviously, we have looked at this also with quite a global perspective, and it's probably one way of saying this is the poorer the country already, the more it's on subsistence type of stimulus, so immediate money in the pocket type of approaches, whereas the more industrialized and particularly European the country, the more it is mixed with a long-term visionary, and it can very well be again green decarb type of vision, but it's probably mostly isolated in Europe that you find the longer-term approaches. I think the one thing that would make me worried in this context is probably the fact that we have obviously office working everywhere, and suddenly a number of companies wake up to the positive realities of home working. But the question from there is not very far to ask why do this in what is the cheapest place to do home office, and why do we need to do it close if you can have it cheaper far away? And I think that's a whole other level of potential impact that we can see as a result of a home office culture that is emerging now as a consequence of COVID. And I think that's obviously one that can have quite deep consequences as well.
Thank you, Christoph. That's very, 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 very helpful. And we are about to close off, and we are kind of at 5 o'clock now, and then so probably it comes. I'll pass on to Jerome for some closing kind of comments. But first of all, I want to thank you also our kind of Arab colleagues and speakers, because they've been fielding questions on the chat line, so they managed kind of to respond. So thank you for that. And if anyone in the audience got further questions, they can definitely kind of reach out and we'll kind of answer and all of those points. And let me thank you, Christoph and Vicky, for the incredible kind of insights that we brought in today and the comments and in response to some of the questions. It's been a kind of fascinating hour. We learned a lot actually, and we shared quite a lot of information and knowledge, and it's good to see that. Jerome, do you want to kind of close off the session with some final comment, please?
Thanks, Filippo, and just let me add my thanks to Christoph and Vicky, and particularly Vicky for her double performance. Vicky joined us this morning as well as this afternoon, and Christoph for your insights there. Thank you so much. And as you know, as was the case this morning, it feels like we'd only just got started before we have to finish. So it's almost frustrating, but you know, this is an ongoing piece of work for Arup. We're committed to continuously revisiting and re-looking at these scenarios. I hope that you, as friends of Arup, can continue to participate in some of these kinds of discussions, and I would encourage all of our listeners who've tuned in today to do the same. And I'd also like to add my thanks to the presenters. Fantastic presentations. Thank you all for setting up today's discussion very, very convincingly. I think, Filippo, that's it. That's it from me. Thank you to all for your organisation of this. We will be following up with this material, recorded both sessions, so people can come back in and revisit some of the points made, as well as others in Arup tuning in at their leisure. Thanks very much.